The first time I saw the bruise, I was 6 years old. My mother was washing dishes at the sink, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows because the water was hot, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window in that yellow way it does in early autumn. I climbed onto the chair beside her to help dry, and that's when I saw it. A dark, purple shape on the inside of her forearm, about the size and shape of a man's hand. 4 fingers and a thumb. She caught me looking. Without saying a word, she reached for a dish towel, dried her hand slowly, and pulled her sleeve back down to her wrist. Then she smiled at me, that small, tight smile I would come to know very well, and said, "The Lord gives us what we can carry, Martha. Now, hand me that plate." I was 6. I didn't understand what I had seen. But I understood her face, and I understood that we were never going to talk about it. Before I tell you about the next 20 years of bruises and the night everything finally broke open, let me introduce myself. My name is Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where I share the truths my community spent generations burying. If you want to hear stories that nobody behind the prayer cap was ever supposed to tell, hit subscribe right now. It costs nothing and it means everything to me. And in the comments, I want you to tell me, did you grow up in a home where silence was treated like a virtue? I read every single comment. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. I grew up Old Order Amish in a small church district in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. My father was a respected man in our community. He served as a minister for 15 years. He prayed loudest at gatherings. He quoted the Ausbund from memory. He shook the bishop's hand every other Sunday with a firm grip and a steady gaze. And behind the closed doors of our farmhouse, when something went wrong, when the milk soured, when a horse threw a shoe, when supper was 5 minutes late, when one of us children laughed too loudly on a Sabbath afternoon, his hands found my mother's body in places her clothes would cover. I want you to understand something about the world I grew up in, because it matters for everything that comes next. In Old Order, Amish communities, marriage is considered a covenant before God. Once you say your vows, that bond is permanent. Divorce does not exist. Separation is rare and shameful. The Ordnung, our unwritten code that governs every aspect of life, treats the family as sacred and private. What happens inside a home stays inside that home. The community looks away, and looking away is dressed up as respect. There is a phrase in Pennsylvania Dutch, gelassenheid, which means yieldedness, surrender, the giving up of the self to God's will. For Amish women, gelassenheid is taught from childhood as the highest virtue. You yield to your father, then to your husband, then to the church, then to God. And if your husband's hand is heavy, well, that too is from God. That too is something to be borne. That is what my mother believed. That is what she was taught. That is what every woman in my family for generations was taught. She had 7 children. I was the 3rd. We lived in a white farmhouse with green shutters at the end of a long dirt lane. To anyone passing by, we looked like a postcard. Buggies in the driveway, laundry on the line, children running barefoot through the garden. My mother kept that house spotless. Her bread was famous in 3 counties. Her quilts were stitched so finely that English tourists would have paid hundreds of dollars for them, though she would never have dreamed of selling. And underneath those long-sleeved dresses, summer and winter, there was always something hidden. I started counting when I was 9. I don't know why I started counting. Maybe because counting was a thing I could control when nothing else was. I kept a little notebook hidden inside my pillowcase, and whenever I saw a new mark, a fingerprint on her wrist, a smudge of yellow across her cheekbone she had tried to powder over with flour, a shadow at the back of her neck where her prayer cap strings tied, I would put a small tick mark on the page. By the time I was 16, I had filled 3 notebooks. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. Here is what no one outside the community understands. My mother never once called it what it was. Not to me, not to her sisters, not to the bishop's wife, not to herself. The vocabulary did not exist in her world. There was no word for what was happening to her. There were only euphemisms. He had a hard day. The Lord is testing me. I bumped into the corner of the dresser. The cow kicked me when I was milking. I fell going down to the cellar. Once, when I was 12, I watched her come down the stairs the morning after a bad night, holding the railing with a hand that was clearly broken, 2 fingers swollen and dark, and she made breakfast for 8 people without a single sound. Then she walked herself to the neighbor's phone shanty, called a driver, and told the English doctor in town that she had slipped on the ice. It was August. The doctor wrote it down. The doctor said nothing. She came home with a splint and made supper that same evening. There was a woman in our church district named Sister Fanny. She was older, in her 70s, and she had the kind of eyes that saw too much. One Sunday after service, when I was about 14, I watched Sister Fanny corner my mother by the buggies. She put a hand on my mother's good arm and she said something quiet, just a few words. I was close enough to hear. She said, "Mary, you do not have to keep doing this." My mother's whole face changed for 1 second. Just 1 second. Something cracked open behind her eyes. And then she closed it back down, smiled that tight smile and said, "Thank you, Sister Fanny. The Lord is good." She walked away. Sister Fanny watched her go with a look I now recognize as grief. She had tried before. She would try again. It would never work. Because my mother had been told her entire life that her suffering was sacred, that to refuse the suffering was to refuse God, and that refusing God meant losing everything: her children, her community, her place at the table, her eternal soul. In a culture where shunning is real and permanent, where leaving means losing every person you have ever loved in this life, the cost of speaking is not just bruises. The cost is your whole world. So she stayed. So she covered. So she lied. So she said it was God's will. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds from the outside. I know it sounds like my father was a monster, and my community was complicit, and the whole thing was evil. And I have spent years in therapy untangling exactly how I feel about all of it. The truth is more complicated than any of those simple stories. My father was a man who had been beaten by his own father, who had been beaten by his father before him. He had no language for his rage. He had no tools for his fear. He had been taught that he was the head of the house, and that any failure of order inside his walls reflected a failure of his manhood before God. He drank no alcohol. He prayed every day. He believed, I am certain, that he was a good man. The community that raised him gave him a role and a costume and a set of rules, and gave him absolutely nothing for the storm inside his own chest. And the community that raised my mother gave her a single instruction for that storm: yield. That is not an excuse. There is no excuse. But it is an explanation. And the explanation matters because it is the same explanation playing out in farmhouses across Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana right now tonight. The night everything broke happened when I was 26 years old. I was already married by then to a kind man named Amish, who had never raised his voice to me, not once. I had 3 children of my own. I was visiting my mother on a Tuesday afternoon in March because the youngest had a cold and I wanted her chamomile remedy. I let myself in through the kitchen door the way I always did, and I found her sitting at the kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon, which she never did, with both hands flat on the wood and her prayer cap crooked and a thin line of blood running from her hairline down past her ear. She did not look up when I came in. She just said very quietly, "I think something is broken this time, Martha." And I knew she did not mean a bone. I sat down across from her. I did not say anything for a long time. I reached across the table and I took her hands. They were so small. They were so thin. I had not held my mother's hands in years, and I said the words that no one in our family had ever said out loud in 3 generations. I said, "Mom, you can come home with me." She started crying. Not loud. Amish women do not cry loud. Just tears running down her face onto the tablecloth she had embroidered herself 30 years before. And she said, "I cannot. He is my husband. This is the cross the Lord has given me." And I said, "Ma'am, the Lord did not give you this cross. A man gave you this cross, and you do not have to carry it for him anymore." She shook her head. She kept shaking her head. She said the line I have heard from Amish women my entire life, the line that has kept generations of us in rooms we should have left. She said, "What would people think?" If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. I want to tell you that she came home with me that day. I want to tell you she packed a bag and walked out and never looked back. That is not what happened. She stayed. She stayed for 4 more years. She died at 58 years old of what the doctor called heart failure. But I know what really failed her. And it was not her heart. Her heart was the strongest thing about her. What failed her was a community that watched her bleed for 40 years and called it faithfulness. What failed her was a theology that taught her the only acceptable response to a man's fist was a softer cheek. What failed her was the silence of every woman who knew. And there were many who knew. The bishop's wife knew. Her sisters knew. The neighbor across the field knew. I knew. We all knew. And we all said nothing because saying something would have cost us our place in the only world we had ever known. After she passed, I left. I took my husband Amish and my children, and we went to a Mennonite community first, then eventually further out into the English world. The shunning came down hard. Letters returned. Phone calls unanswered. My father would not look at me at the funeral. He has not spoken my name in 7 years. I went to therapy. I learned the words my mother never had: domestic violence, coercive control, trauma bonding, generational abuse. I learned that her flinching when a door slammed was not nervousness, it was a body remembering. I learned that her tight smile was not peace, it was a survival strategy. I learned that the bruises I counted in my notebooks were not the worst of what she carried. The worst of what she carried was the belief that she deserved them. My therapist asked me one afternoon, almost 2 years in, what I would say to my mother now if she could hear me. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the kitchen window and the yellow light and the dish towel and her sleeve sliding down over her wrist. And I said, I would tell her that gelassenheit is not a bruise. That yielding to God does not mean yielding to a man's hand. That the God who made her did not make her to be broken slowly across 40 years in a farmhouse at the end of a dirt lane. That her suffering was not sacred. It was just suffering. And it never had to be hers. If you want to go deeper, the full Amish Insider Guide is in the description. If you grew up watching a woman you loved cover something with her sleeve, I see you. If you were taught that your mother's pain was holy, that her silence was strength, that her endurance was the proof of her faith, I am here to tell you it was not. It was a cage built by men, and blessed by men, and locked by men. And the key was always silence. The first time you say the true word for what you saw, the cage starts to open. Not all at once, not cleanly, but it starts. My mother never said the true word. I am saying it for her now. Every time I sit in front of this camera, every time I tell one of these stories, every time another woman writes to me and says, Martha, this was my mother too. This was my grandmother too. This was me too. You are not alone. You were never alone. You were just told to be quiet. If this story stayed with you, leave me a comment and tell me what part hit you the hardest. Tell me about the woman in your own life who covered something with her sleeve. And if you want more honest stories from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. There is so much more I have not said yet. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save someone you love.